Hello everybody and welcome to 3 Colors Up. In this one we're going to be tackling the Panther D. This is the initial version of the Panther that was used by the German army in World War II, deployed in 1943 to the Battle of Kursk. That was one of its first sort of combat operations. Not a tank that has gone down in history particularly well, certainly not the D model anyway. The A model got a bit better, and the G model, which ended the war, was a lot better than what the initial one was. A lot of failings with basic design, huge failure in the amount of testing done before the tanks were deployed. They sort of rushed the test phase, sent them out to see what would happen. Crews suffered a lot of problems with breakdowns, engine fires, and the tanks really had to, a lot of them had to come back to the factory after, if they were recovered, and modifications were made. So what you'd find is this particular model didn't last in the field very long. I think a matter of months, maybe, before feedback was sent back to the factories like MAN, Maybach, and all that sort of stuff. All had a look at it, took it back to the factory, went back through the plans and went, okay, based on the feedback we should have done before they were sent to the field, what do we need to do to change these things? So, for example, there's a restored version of a Panther in America, previously owned by Jacques Littlefield. There's documentaries on it. There's plenty of videos of it on YouTube. The Chieftain from World of Tanks, big fan of that guy, does a very comprehensive run through of what a Panther was like. Now, the Panther they have in that collection is a late model, I believe it's a late model D, but it's more changed to the A variant. So it's one of the initial D variants that was sent back to the factory and modified and sent back out again. So it will have features on the tank that this one doesn't. So there's a hatch in the side of the turret that was deleted. They changed the hull machine gun position. The Jacques Littlefield Panther still has the direct vision slot on the front of the glacis plate. That was eventually deleted, I think, in the later model A's, and then certainly not present in the G models. Anyway, all of that to say, we're painting a Panther based on the, we're going to say it, the initial D. Get some initial D playing there while you're watching this video as well. And show you the quirks and how we paint this model to represent a unit that was at Kursk. Now, we're going to be doing this without any airbrushes. We're going to go in with some dry brushing effects and so on and so forth and play around with it. So for you guys that are sometimes comment saying, but I don't want to use an airbrush, or is there another way I can do it just without using one? Because I know a few people recently have been telling me, oh, the setup is a little annoying. I don't have enough room in my house. Totally fine. We'll see if you enjoy this style of technique and this style of doing your camouflage. Give it a go, and you can let me know in the comments below, which I say at the end of the video as well. Anyway, enough of my tank babble and rambling and so on. Let's just get stuck in and let's paint it. So before we get started on our Panther D, I'll just explain that all the parts that were made of resin, because this is a resin plastic hybrid kit, had to be washed and scrubbed properly before we did anything else like priming. So it's been primed in Citadel Chaos Black, and after the wash it's turned out quite nice. It's nice and neat. The hull and the turret, the main body of the turret and the gun mantlet are the resin pieces. Everything else is plastic. So overall, it's a very tidy sculpt. It's a very tidy cast. We have plenty of detail, and it's going to look pretty good once we have it all painted up. So our first stage is to do a little bit of somewhat tentative pre-shading, because I'm not too sure if I'd feel comfortable not pre-shading it before putting any color down. So we're going to be doing a bit of that. But we're not going to be using airbrushes in this one, like I've said, and we're going to start by dry brushing the whole vehicle with Praxeti White. So this is just to get a little bit of texture and pre-shade onto the model. And we're going to be using a large shade brush from Citadel for this. So we want to get as much paint off the brush as possible before we start on this stage. And we're going to remove the turret, and the stage is going to literally be take from an upper location on the miniature and start to dry brush up. It looks like we're going to need a bit more paint on the brush for that, so we're really going to Put a lot more paint on the brush this time. That seems to be about right. And now it's going to be a case of buffing the whole vehicle up with our Praxeti white and getting a little bit of pre-shade done. So this may take a while, but I'm going to try and avoid using an airbrush in this video, so let's see what we get. With the white now down, you can see it's quite messy looking. I've basically had to overbrush the whole thing, so I had to go a lot heavier to get some of that white to stick down, basically. But in general, we have everything we wanted. So we have a bit of texture on the hull. We have the main details that we wanted to be highlighted are now highlighted. We've got some foreshadow in there in between all the wheels and a bit on the engine deck as well. It's all looking pretty tidy to me. Now, our next step is Vallejo model color German Beige World War II. And we're going to be applying that, well, probably, hopefully, going to be applying that using a small dry brush, but we're going to be dampening the bristles a little bit. So we're not actually going to be dry brushing it, we are going to be layering it on. But we're going to be, again, trying to aim to be fast and effective. Sort of, I'm trying to replicate the slap chop technique that we recently talked about on a weekender, and I felt like it would be worth having a go at it because, well, you know, it's worth having a go. See if we can do it, or something that's relatively effective. So we're going to apply this, again, all over the miniature, and we'll see if it's thin enough to retain some of our pre-shade. If not, so be it. It's not the end of the world if it doesn't work. So with our beige now down nice and sort of thin, we can see that it still looks a little bit messy, but don't worry. I'm hoping as much as you are that it's going to look better in a few more steps. So our next thing to do is our camouflage. And for the camouflage, we're going to be doing Vallejo model color uniform green. We're going with this color because it seems to be like one of the more common camouflage schemes, this two-tone of the beige and this green, with the period I'm looking at, which is sort of the Kursk period, because a Panther D is basically the Kursk Panther. It's the one that, well, some of them didn't catch fire. So we're going to be applying this with a dry brush. We're going to be using one of the Army Painter, their Wargamer small dry brush for this one. And again, we're going to be applying it almost like a bit of an overbrush. Same with the white. So we're not going to be taking a lot of paint off the brush, but we're going to be taking off enough that we can basically scuff a camouflage pattern on. So it's going to be a case of sort of stippling here is kind of what I'm aiming for here. And we're going to stipple our green onto the vehicle. So let's just get on with that and see where we go. So pick up a bit more paint in the brush. And it's just going to be a case of going over the whole vehicle and just seeing what we come up with. So now we have our camouflage done. You can start to see where I'm going with the application of the colors in this manner. And I think we're onto something here. So the next stage is going to be to work this green down a little bit. We're going to fade it in a little bit. So we're going to be returning to our beige color, and we're going to be, again, applying it with our big shade brush. But we're not going to be thinning it as much this time. We are actually going to be attempting to overbrush over the top of everything that we've just done. So let's see if this works. So the plan is to try and work over, as you can see, it's sort of working there. It's a little bit heavy, but we want to work over the existing paintwork in a sort of a circular, kind of up and down a little bit, and sort of make this paint look a little lighter and a little more worn in, because we don't want it to be just as stark as it currently is, but it is the right color. We just want to start bringing it down a little bit. So the other way to do this would have been to make the initial layer of camouflage a mix, sort of 50-50 of the Panzer Beige and the green. But I think if you're not as confident as mixing paints, then you just want to try and work the paint back in again. This also helps smooth out some of our earlier step as well, and lets us do a little bit of a tidy up. So it kind of works more as a correctional step as well as an extra stage to add some more detail to the model. But this isn't going to be the highlight step. There is actually going to be another highlight step, or a highlight step after this. So it's just a case of going over and just working down this green a little bit with these little rotational motions with the brush. And then once that's done, we can look at some washing over the miniature. So with our camouflage now faded down, you can see what I'm aiming at here is a bit more of a faded sort of color scheme here. More because a lot of the camouflage would have been applied in haste. They would have had limited supply, especially when they were getting ready for Kursk. And a lot of the Panthers would have had the paint, the camouflage applied very thin because they just needed to get it done. So with that stage done now, we're going to move on to do a little bit of a wash, but we're going to be using a contrast paint, and for that we're going to be using Skeleton Horde. This is going to help shade our model down and hopefully at least make it look a little bit more interesting. We want to get some of that shading together. But we're going to do this as thinly as possible, so I really don't want to oversaturate the model with this. I want it to be quite thin. So I think relatively thin on the palette there, probably a bit thinner to be honest. And again, we're just going to be applying it all over the miniature. And this is really just to get some of our panel lines and stuff back in and start to uniform up the coloration. There won't be a lot of weathering on this vehicle because I want it to look more like a vehicle that's recently, you know, it's a recent addition to the Panzer Force. So we're definitely aiming for a more Kursk-like sort of appearance here, not too heavily worn, not too heavily used yet. There'll be a little bit of weathering here and there, but nothing too significant for this step, or nothing too significant for this vehicle. With our Skeleton Horde dry, we can see that we've got a bit more shading down on the vehicle. It's looking a little heavier, a little more purposeful. Our earlier steps, particularly with the sort of white overbrush and then the beige overbrush, they're still a little bit visible, but I'm not actually that worried about it. And the fading in of the green camouflage is definitely starting to look a bit more interesting. So now, at this stage, we're going to be highlighting our hull and our turret. And for that, we're going to be using Vallejo model color Stone Grey. We're picking this color because it's very similar. If I point out in the palette here, this is our beige and this is our Stone Grey. So our Stone Grey is a bit of a whiter, a closer to white color than our beige is. So hopefully a little bit of a light dry brush of this will add a little bit of highlighting as well as a little touch, maybe just a tiniest little touch of a sort of a dusty look as well. So what I want to do is get this big brush loaded up and prepared, make sure it's not too heavy, and then it's going to be a case of lightly working on the edges and upper surfaces of the model. Work our way around, sort of get our edge highlighting up a little bit. Because at the minute, the beige is looking a bit dark, you know, the fading that we did with the Skeleton Horde over it has darkened it down a little bit, and it's maybe just a touch too dark now. It just looks a little out of place. So we need this sort of lighter color to go in and do a little bit of tidying up, a little bit of brightening up. So very light over the upper hull. Really don't want to add a lot to it. And then further down here, if we want to try and make this become a little bit of a dusty layer as well, we'll go a little bit heavier across our wheels and across the lower side of the side skirt as well. Not too much though, we just want to sort of lighten that side up just a little bit with our dusty look. So that seems to be okay. Now obviously a proper dust would be more sort of pigment powder work, but I've decided that we're going to be doing a much simpler approach to everything on this model. We're going to try and not use stuff that maybe some of you don't have, particularly with the airbrushing side of things. I really wanted to see if we could achieve something interesting and good for tabletop without using the airbrush, because I know a few guys are still sort of either on the fence or just don't want to do airbrush work, and that's totally fine too. So we just want to work on alternative methods that get the technique and get the vehicle done to a degree that still looks good, but without the extra steps of having airbrushes and pigment powders and stuff like that. So this is also helping to fade in a little bit of our skeleton horde too. So, but again, we don't want to go too heavy with that. Now with our greystone dry brush applied to the whole model, we're going to move on and start doing some detail work. And for this, we're going to be using Black Templar contrast paint. This is going to be focused on certain details. Let me get a proper brush here and we can get started. So let me put it on the palette here. What I want to use the Black Templar for is to paint our tracks in, paint the rubber rings on the outer road wheels, the spare track, the metal tools, the metal parts of the tools that are there. We'll thin it down a little bit and paint in probably some of these grills here. We'll do a little thin wash of it into these grills, on our exhausts, on our spare track, and other bits and bobs here as well. So the idea again is to keep it simple. And for example, like on the track here, we can just throw it on there and it doesn't really matter what the underlying colors are, because they're all going to help in the end when we're working on our sort of dustiness, sort of dusty look. We again trying to make this Panther look a little more new, because as we tank nerds tend to talk about a lot, the Panther's debut was Kursk, and we're trying to do a Kursk coloured Panther, or a Kursk themed Panther. So we want to make it look a little less heavily used than some people would with a lot of the German armour. So again, I have been taking inspiration from some scale models as well, who seem to lean into the more new looking Panther, which again, totally right as far as I'm concerned. So that's what we're trying to aim for with every step that we're doing here, as well as making sure we're keeping it nice and simple and easily achievable. With our Black Templar now down and dry over some of the metal parts for our tooling, spare tracks, exhaust, and the black rims around the wheels, including their spare up on the turret, don't forget that. I also did the Black Templar onto our periscopes as well, because they're kind of hooded, so just adding a little bit of dark in there and along the vision slots on the commander's cupola as well just adds a bit more to it. It doesn't take very long to do, but it's something that even at a gaming distance you'll notice, because you're accentuating that detail that otherwise would just be kind of lost in and amongst the sea of beige and green. So what we're moving on to now is the wooden parts on our tools, and for that we're going to be using, again, Vallejo model color, beige brown. And this is just, again, very simple. Just going to go in with a little bit of that on my brush and very carefully touch in the wooden parts of the pioneering tools that are on board. So what we'll do is do that, and then what we're trying to aim for here is a little bit of base paint just around here where this vertical line comes down, because this is the location of a clamp that holds, for example in this case our shovel, holds the shovel in place. There'll also be one on the axe, but this bar would be the handle and the clamp would be right at the end. So you can leave a little bit of the base color right at this end, just to represent that. So over on the other side, we have a few more bits and bobs here. We have this block, which is a wooden block to put the track jack onto, or the tank jack onto. So that, the upper and lower rectangle shapes are the exposed wood. So we can just get those in. I need to put a bit more water on the brush here. And just carefully paint those in. We can make sure that we've got the top part as well, because the top part will also be wood, so in here. Like so. It would also be exposed on the ends of this piece as well, because this banding not only is part of the clamping mechanism, but it also holds the block together because it's made of several layers of wood. So it's all banded together. As long as we don't go over the edge. I can just get a little bit of that brown in there. Now this is going a little bit further than what you really need to, but that little bit of extra coloration will always stand out a little bit more. We then have a couple of, I think these, the top one I've done in Black Templar, these three things here, because I think that's the tanker bar or the pry bar, but I think the bottom two are wood, so correct me if I'm wrong, I could be wrong. But I'm using it as an excuse to add more color to the vehicle. I haven't seen many Panthers with all the tooling and stuff on them, so I'm not, offhand, I'm just not sure what these are, but I figured if I did two of them in a wood color and one in a metal, you know, I can be half right, or partly right at least. So, that's all we need to do for our wood. We're now going to move on to a little bit of a wash, and this is model color, again Vallejo, light rust wash. And we're going to be applying this to our spare track and to our exhausts, because exhausts get hot and spare track isn't really taken care of that much. So again, get our same brush, maybe dampen it a bit more, put a bit more water in there, because it's quite a reddy, it's quite a vibrant sort of wash. So this also gives a nice contrast between the Black Templar contrast paint and a little bit of rust effect to build up on. This track probably would have either, in reality, would have probably been taken off the tank while the tank was being painted, at least in the beige. Sometimes you might see the track on there and maybe the camouflage has been carried over it just because it's expedient. Spare track is heavy, Panther track is incredibly heavy, so you want to probably just leave that on there to save your back a little bit of injury. But in general, this stuff would either have arrived from the factory with a base coat, probably this black, or a carboned sort of finish, just to, you know, just from the forging process, but it would rust pretty quick. So again, on the exhausts, same principle with the exhausts. The exhausts would have been a colour out of the factory, quite possibly just black straight out of the factory. But because they're constantly heating and cooling with the engine running, these exhausts can get very hot. So the any protective coating would have been burned away and would have allowed it to start rusting pretty quick. I think within the first few hours of the engine running, rust would have started to build up. And again, just on this side of the spare track too. Other than that, I'm not really tempted to do any more rust than this. I know there'll be a few places people would say, oh, well, you might have had a bit of rust building up pretty quickly in these locations on the vehicle. Yeah, you're probably right. But at the same time, I don't want the vehicle to look like it's been out for very long. So with a little bit of rust effect down, we're going to move on to another contrast paint. And this one is going to be Wyldwood, the very dark brown. And this is purely for the tracks. That's the only reason we're doing this. Because we want to add not just a black, but we want to get a bit of a brown build up in there as well before we move on. So again, just dampen it and thin it out a little bit, because Wyldwood is an incredibly heavy contrast paint. And we want to apply that over our tracks for very little other reason than just having the track give off a bit of a brown tone. We don't want it to be just pure black. We want it to have something else working on in there. But we'll not be taking it up over the wheels. We're just going to be going along all the track. Alright, now our Wyldwood is dry. We have 2 more steps left to go, and the first one is going to be a bit of a dry brush on our tracks, and we're going to be going with Citadel Necron Compound. Good, easy, simple little thing to do here. So, as always, we're going to be just putting some on the brush and then wiping the majority of it back off again. I'm going to do the time old tradition of checking it on my hand. It's quite, yeah, that's enough. And then on our tracks, let's take the turret off before it falls. It's just going to be a case of wiping it along the tracks, perpendicular to the grousers. That gets us our nice used look, makes it look like the Panther's actually been doing something and going places. Apart from catching fire at Kursk. And then along the bottom of our track here as well, just want to touch the edges of the tracks. Just a little bit like that. Carry that up into the back. Pretty short and sweet step that just gives us a bit more visual interest on the model. We can do this as much or as little as we want. I just prefer to make the tracks look good and shiny, because from a tabletop perspective, that's going to stand out really nice. So, with that done, remember how I said I wasn't going to do any large amounts of weathering? Well, I kind of lied. So we're going to move on to German Camouflage Black Brown, a very dark brown. And we're going to use that just to add a little bit of chipping. Some of you are going to be like, but John, you said you wanted to make the tank look new. Yes, I did. And I still do. That's still part of what I want to achieve here. But it just wouldn't be a tank, would it, if it didn't have some sort of just a little bit of mild weathering. So that's why I'm going to apply it with a brush this time, other than my usual application of a sponge. That's mainly because I want to really target areas where obviously the crew would be climbing up onto the vehicle. So sort of up here, along here. Let's move the turret around a bit. That. Down onto the fenders a little bit too, I think. In this kind of scenario, weathering this kind of vehicle that's meant to be new and in the field, less really is more. We're going to get a lot more impact for the small amount of weathering and chipping that we're going to be doing. A little bit along the peak. Maybe a touch up around the hatches. And then up onto our turret sides. Around here. A bit up onto the commander's cupola. Maybe a little bit more on the cupola. But again, not very much. Then again, on our turret sides. onto our engine deck. Again, going to be a bit of an area of higher wear because you're going to have tank maintenance, there's going to be engine maintenance and tweaking and stuff going on to these vehicles as they were arriving in the Kursk area. So just make that a little bit heavier. Plus it's a large flat spot on the vehicle. People are going to be walking over this, scraping the paint up with their boots, with the metal grips and stuff in them like that. So if you had infantry climbing on this vehicle, it wouldn't take very long for your paint to start being worn and chipped away. We're going to do a little bit down the sides. Again, want to keep it as fresh as possible, but not to the point of just being a factory new vehicle, as much as they were in reality at this point in history. A little bit on the lifting eyes, on that front edge of the turret like that. And really, that's about as much as I'd want to do to our Panther. Maybe a little bit more there. Just a couple of little spots maybe where people have been climbing up a bit. Other than that, that's really as far as I'd want to take this. So what we're going to be doing off camera is giving the vehicle a matte varnish. We're going to be using our typical, let me reach for it here. We're going to be giving it a coat of ultra matte. We're going to be brushing this on. We're not using any airbrushes again in this video. And when you see it next, it's going to be done, going to be all nicely matted down, and then we can round up the video. And here we have our completed Panther Ausrung D. And it's a good looking model. I love Battlefront's plastic resin hybrids. I love that they moved away from the metal resin hybrids and went with the plastic sprues. First seen that with some of the half tracks they did for the Germans, and now we're getting it in tanks and other stuff like that. What it's allowing them to do is retain the individuality of some of these other well-known kits that they have. So some of the more niche units as well, particularly Panther D, because Panther D really is Kursk, and then beyond that it became the A model. They started to take them back to the factory and modify them based on feedback, and that became the Panther A, then later on to the G. But what we have here is a nice solid representation of a Panther in that era. We have the initial batch of Panthers coming to Kursk, being put through their paces, essentially tested in the field rather than being tested properly, and really falling short of the expectations placed upon them. But what we get here in miniature form is a good solid color scheme that didn't require an airbrush, didn't require any complex techniques or anything like that. Very achievable in my opinion. You guys can let me know in the comments if you agree with me on that. If you like how the camouflage has turned out and how the base colors have worked, do try it yourself and let me know what you think. Beyond that, everything else is just straightforward. A little bit of wash, a little bit of contrast paint here and there wherever it was necessary, or wherever it could add to the overall effect of the paint scheme. So all in all, guys, I think this is quite a good one. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you've taken away a couple of little ideas to try for yourself. But until then, take care, stay safe, and see you again very soon.
Go ahead and check out our other content on screen now. And while you're at it, why not hit subscribe and remember to ding our dong. Go on, you know you want to click it. Go on.